The Galactic Council Assembly convenes in the massive diplomatic complex orbiting the neutral station that serves as Alliance Administrative Center, the physical and political heart of the cooperative framework that binds together dozens of independent governments across hundreds of star systems. The Assembly is convened today for specific ceremonial purpose, to witness Empress Seraphina's formal selection of her consort, a decision that carries enormous political weight throughout the Alliance. The Thessari Empire is the most powerful single government in the Alliance, largest territory, most advanced military capabilities, most developed economic infrastructure. Seraphina's decisions as Thessari sovereign affect not just her own people, but the entire network of alliance relationships that depend on Thessari cooperation and leadership. Her consort choice matters because Thessari governance structure gives the consort significant authority, not just ceremonial position but genuine co-sovereignty that includes decision-making power over territorial administration, economic policy, and strategic military planning. Who becomes her consort will help determine how the Thessari Empire approaches its alliance relationships for the next generation, which policies get prioritized, which governments receive favorable treatment in trade negotiations and security cooperation. The decision affects hundreds of star systems directly through economic relationships and security arrangements, and affects countless more indirectly through the cascading implications of how the galaxy's most powerful government orients its strategic priorities. The Assembly spans worlds. Representatives from dozens of alliance governments participate through holorelay technology, their holographic presences filling the massive council chamber while their physical bodies remain on their home worlds, allowing real-time participation in council proceedings without requiring the time and resources that physical travel across interstellar distances would demand. The chamber itself is architectural marvel designed specifically for this kind of multi-world gathering. Massive space with holographic projection systems that create stable, high-fidelity representations of distant participants. Acoustic systems that ensure clear communication despite the technical complexity of coordinating audio across dozens of simultaneous connections. Visual displays showing banners and insignia of distant systems, hanging in suspended light above each delegation's position, creating atmosphere of multi-civilization cooperation despite the vast physical distances separating the actual participants. The technology works seamlessly. Delegates from worlds hundreds of light years apart can see and hear each other clearly, can engage in real-time discussion despite the distances, can participate in council proceedings with nearly the same immediacy as if everyone were physically present in the same room. Every decision made in this chamber echoes across trade routes and war corridors. The Council's authority derives from voluntary consensus among member governments, and its proceedings determine alliance policy on everything from economic cooperation frameworks to military coordination protocols to dispute resolution mechanisms. The Council doesn't govern the alliance in the sense of having sovereign authority over member governments. Each government remains independent and sovereign within its own territories. But the Council facilitates cooperation, coordinates responses to shared challenges, provides forum for resolving disputes without warfare, creates frameworks that make intergovernment relationships more stable and predictable. Decisions made here about trade policy affect which goods flow along which routes, determining prosperity for commercial centers and economic opportunities for billions of people. Decisions about military coordination affect which governments can rely on alliance support during security crises, and which operations receive combined resources rather than leaving individual governments to address threats alone. Objections are a common feature of council proceedings. Dissent is expected and protected. Nothing significant passes without resistance and debate. The entire framework is built on assumption that contested decisions require multiple perspectives before reaching conclusions that serve collective interests rather than just benefiting particular governments at others' expense. Representatives challenge proposals that disadvantage their constituents. Delegates raise concerns about unintended consequences. Factions form around different approaches to shared problems. The normal state of council business is vigorous debate with multiple rounds of revision before reaching compromises that enough governments can accept to create working consensus. That's how the council functions. through argument and negotiation and gradual convergence on positions that balance competing interests while serving overall alliance stability and cooperation. But today's proceeding is different. Empress Serafina's consort selection isn't policy proposal requiring council debate and approval. It's sovereign's personal decision that affects political landscape, but that remains fundamentally her choice to make rather than being subject to council consensus processes. The council has no authority to approve or reject her selection. Thessari sovereign chooses her own consort according to Thessari law and tradition, and other governments have no legal standing to interfere with that internal governance decision. However, the political implications are so significant, affecting alliance relationships, economic partnerships, military cooperation frameworks, all the interconnected systems that depend on stable Thessari leadership, that Serafina has chosen to formalize her selection before the assembled council. Not seeking approval, but demonstrating transparency about decision that will affect alliance dynamics, providing opportunity for affected governments to understand how her choice reshapes relationships and to adjust their own planning accordingly. Building political capital by showing respect for alliance partners even while making decision that remains entirely within her sovereign authority. The chamber is filled with representatives from across the alliance. Human governments, Thessari regional administrations, dozens of other species and political entities that participate in alliance cooperation frameworks. All present, physically or through hollow relay, to witness the moment when Empress Serafina formalizes her consort choice. The atmosphere is tense with anticipation and calculation. Everyone present understands that this decision will reshape political geometry across significant portion of the galaxy. Everyone has analyzed the likely candidates and has formed assessments about which selection would benefit or disadvantage their particular interests. Some hope she'll choose candidate from powerful government, whose alliance with Thessari Empire would shift military balance in ways that serve their security interests. Others hope she'll choose candidate whose economic background would prioritize trade relationships that benefit commercial partnerships they depend on. Still others have specific preferences based on complex multi-government relationships where particular consort choices would strengthen or weaken different factional alignments. The Assembly represents thousands of calculations about how Serafina's choice will affect their interests. Millions of people whose lives will be influenced by cascading implications of who shares sovereign authority over the galaxy's most powerful government. And in the center of all this political weight and strategic calculation, Empress Serafina stands at the central dais with composed bearing that shows no indication of the pressure or the implications. She looks completely at ease, the weight of 1,000 alliances resting effortlessly on her shoulders, not because the weight is light, but because she's so accustomed to carrying it that the burden has become natural rather than crushing. 15 years of sovereign rule. 15 years of making decisions that affect billions of lives. 15 years of building political capital and earning respect through effective governance and strategic relationship management. She's the most powerful individual in the alliance, not through military force or economic coercion, but through accumulated authority that comes from being consistently competent, consistently fair, consistently effective at managing complex multi-government relationships in ways that serve collective interests while protecting Thessari sovereignty. Her decisions carry weight because people trust her judgment, because she's demonstrated over 15 years that she understands implications and consequences, because when she makes choices, they're typically well-considered and strategically sound even when they're initially surprising or controversial. That accumulated authority is what allows her to stand at the center dais looking completely composed, while thousands of representatives wait to learn which choice she's made and how it will reshape their political calculations. Among the assembled candidates, there are 7 individuals formally presented as potential consorts according to Thessari protocols. Stands Dr. David Chen. He's human cultural advisor who has worked closely with Empress Serafina for 3 years on alliance integration projects, helping facilitate cooperation between human and Thessari administrative systems, providing cultural expertise that prevents misunderstandings in diplomatic and economic relationships, serving as bridge between different governance traditions and communication styles. His position is respected but not particularly powerful. Cultural advisors are valued for their expertise, but they don't command significant resources or control strategic decision-making the way military commanders or economic ministers do. David is not the strongest candidate by traditional measures of political advantage. Lord Vethros stands among the candidates, Thessari noble from ancient house with extensive political connections, whose selection would strengthen internal Thessari factional relationships and consolidate power among traditional aristocratic families. Obvious choice from perspective of internal Thessari politics. Ambassador Marcus Webb stands among the candidates, senior human diplomat whose selection would formalize the human-Thessari relationship as primary alliance axis, whose economic and political connections would bring substantial resources and strategic partnerships that would benefit both governments. Obvious choice from perspective of alliance political geometry. Commander Cathara stands among the candidates, Thessari military leader whose selection would emphasize security priorities and military strength, whose background would appeal to factions concerned about external threats and about maintaining Thessari military superiority. Obvious choice from perspective of strategic security. There are others as well, each representing different political calculations, each bringing specific advantages that would appeal to different constituencies, each selected for presentation because they represent viable options that would serve Thessari interests in particular ways. David is not wealthiest candidate. His personal resources are modest. His family connections are ordinary rather than powerful. He brings no significant economic partnerships or commercial relationships that would enrich Thessari treasury or expand trade networks. He's not most strategically advantageous from traditional political perspective. His selection wouldn't consolidate internal Thessari power structures, wouldn't formalize dominant alliance relationship, wouldn't emphasize any particular policy priority that major factions are pushing. He stands there because circumstance placed him in orbit of Seraphina's influence long enough to be considered. 3 years of working closely with her on integration projects. 3 years of demonstrating genuine competence at facilitating cooperation between different governmental systems. 3 years of showing cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skill that made complex coordination actually work, rather than just performing cooperation while maintaining traditional barriers. 3 years of being someone Seraphina worked with regularly, whose judgment she came to trust, whose perspective she found valuable when addressing challenges that required understanding multiple cultural frameworks simultaneously. That accumulated working relationship made him viable candidate despite his modest position. Not because he brought traditional political advantages, but because Seraphina had direct personal experience with his capabilities and his compatibility with her governance approach. Still, viable candidate is different from expected choice. Most observers analyzing the selection assume Seraphina will choose one of the more obviously advantageous options. Lord Vethros for internal political consolidation. Ambassador Webb for alliance relationship formalization. Commander Cathara for security emphasis. David is respected option, acceptable choice that wouldn't create major problems, but not the choice that strategic calculation would obviously recommend if optimizing for political advantage. He knows this, understands that his presence among the candidates reflects Seraphina's respect for their working relationship, but that the actual selection will likely go to someone whose choice serves clearer strategic purposes. He's present because protocol requires all viable candidates to be physically or holographically present during the formalization ceremony. But he has no expectation of actually being chosen when more advantageous options exist. The moment arrives for Seraphina to formalize the binding, the public declaration of her choice that creates legal and political reality of consort selection. The chamber falls completely silent. Thousands of representatives across dozens of worlds watching through hollow relays or through broadcast systems, all focused on this single moment, when Seraphina will speak the name that determines who shares sovereign authority over the galaxy's most powerful government. She stands at the center dais, perfectly composed, showing no indication of internal deliberation or last-minute reconsideration. The decision already made, the moment just requiring formal declaration. She doesn't survey the assembled candidates as if making difficult choice in the moment. Doesn't perform deliberation for political effect. Doesn't create dramatic pause that suggests uncertainty or that this decision is being made rather than being revealed. She simply looks directly at David, not glancing among the candidates, not considering options. Just direct, focused attention on the person she's choosing, the decision already settled long before this ceremonial moment. Her eyes meet his across the space of the chamber. Direct eye contact that communicates certainty rather than question. Then she speaks, a single word, David. His name, nothing more. No title, no formal designation. No explanation or justification. Just the name itself serving as complete declaration of her selection. It carries clearly across every channel, every relay, every chamber where leaders watch and calculate the implications of her choice. The audio systems designed for this multi-world assembly ensure that the single word reaches every participant with perfect clarity. No distortion. No delay, just Seraphina's voice speaking David's name with absolute certainty. The word is spoken with the kind of authority that makes further elaboration unnecessary. Not, I choose David, or my selection is David, or, after careful consideration, I have decided that David should serve as consort. Just David, the name spoken as complete statement, as if the choice is so obvious, so settled, that nothing beyond the name itself requires saying. It communicates finality. This is not proposal subject to discussion. This is not suggestion open to negotiation. This is decision made by sovereign authority, declared publicly, now reality that everyone must accept and adapt to. The single word carries more weight than speeches defending the selection could convey. Because the brevity itself demonstrates confidence, Seraphina doesn't need to justify her choice or explain her reasoning or persuade anyone that this is appropriate decision. She just states it, and the statement itself, spoken with her accumulated 15 years of authority and demonstrated judgment, carries sufficient weight that explanation would actually weaken rather than strengthen it. David stands frozen in the attention. He heard his name spoken clearly, understood that Seraphina just selected him as her consort before the assembled Galactic Council, processing the reality that he's just been elevated from cultural advisor to co-sovereign of the galaxy's most powerful government through single words spoken with absolute certainty. Around him, the other candidates show varying reactions. Lord Vethros maintains composed dignity despite not being chosen. Ambassador Webb shows professional acceptance of outcome different from what human diplomatic planning anticipated. Commander Cathara displays military discipline even while processing unexpected selection. But all the candidates' reactions are secondary. The primary question is how the assembled council, how the thousands of representatives and the billions of people they represent. There is a pause after Seraphina speaks David's name. Not shocked silence. That would suggest the choice is scandalous or completely unexpected. Not immediate response. That would suggest the selection was so obvious that no processing time is needed. Just pause, the kind that usually fills with protest as various factions object to decisions that affect their interests. The kind that normally carries urgent recalibration as delegations consult with each other about whether to challenge the announced outcome. In typical council proceedings, any significant decision is followed by this kind of pause before objections begin. Representatives consulting their notes, confirming their positions, coordinating with allied delegations about whether and how to contest the proposal. The pause after Seraphina's declaration has that same quality, the space where opposition would normally formulate and where challenges would normally be voiced. But nothing comes. No objections, no urgent consultations. No delegation requesting pause to consider implications. No representative rising to challenge the selection or to question whether it serves alliance interests. Just silence. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of acceptance. It spreads through the chamber in visible wave. One delegation after another processing the choice, recognizing that it's settled, adjusting their understanding to accommodate the new reality rather than fighting against it. The human delegation, Ambassador Webb and his advisors, show brief consultation among themselves. Quick exchange about whether to object to choice that wasn't the formal alliance leadership consolidation that human diplomatic planning had anticipated. But the consultation concludes rapidly with visible acceptance. Webb nods acknowledgement of Seraphina's selection, his bearing communicating that human government accepts the choice and will work with it rather than challenging it. The Thessari regional representatives, various provincial governors and administrative leaders who have interests in consort selection, because it affects internal Thessari power dynamics, show similar pattern. Brief consultations about whether David's selection disadvantages their factional interests enough to warrant objection. But those consultations conclude with acceptance rather than challenge. Regional leaders recognizing that opposing Serafina's judgment about appropriate consort would cost them more political capital than accepting a choice that doesn't optimize their particular factional advantages. Military delegations from various alliance governments, commanders and strategic planners whose security interests are affected by who shares authority over Thessari military capabilities, process the implications rapidly. They had preferences. Commander Cathara's selection would have emphasized security priorities in ways they found advantageous. Other candidates would have brought different strategic orientations that various military factions would have preferred. But David's selection doesn't threaten their core security interests. He's not hostile to military cooperation. He's not committed to economic priorities that would disadvantage security spending. He's just not their first choice. And the calculation they all make rapidly is the same. Objecting to Serafina's consort choice when that choice is clearly within her sovereign authority, and when the selected candidate is competent even if not optimal. That costs more in relationship with the galaxy's most powerful military than it gains in shifting toward preferred candidate. The pattern repeats across every delegation. Brief consideration of whether to object. Rapid conclusion that acceptance serves their interests better than opposition, not because they all prefer David as consort, but because they all recognize that opposing Serafina's clearly stated preference when she has 15 years of demonstrated competent judgment, and when her choice is viable even if not their preferred option. That's political fight they're choosing not to engage in. Lord Vethros, representing internal Thessari aristocratic interests, could object that David's selection disadvantages traditional power structures. But Vethros recognizes that challenging Serafina's judgment publicly would weaken his own position more than accepting a consort choice that doesn't favor his faction. Various economic interests could object that David doesn't bring commercial partnerships or trade relationships that would enrich their specific industries. But they recognize that he's not hostile to economic cooperation, and that maintaining good relationship with Serafina matters more than optimizing consort selection for their narrow commercial advantages. One by one, every potential source of opposition reaches the same conclusion: acceptance rather than challenge, not enthusiastic endorsement, not celebration of optimal choice. Just pragmatic recognition that opposing Serafina's stated decision isn't worth the political cost when the selected candidate is acceptable even if not preferred. The silence extends. 30 seconds, a minute. Time enough for any serious objection to be formulated and voiced if anyone intended to challenge the selection. Nothing comes. Only acceptance spreading through the assembly in quiet acknowledgement, delegates nodding to each other. Delegations updating their strategic planning to accommodate new reality. Everyone adjusting to the fact that Dr. David Chen is now consort-select to Empress Serafina and will share sovereign authority over the Thessari Empire. The lack of objection is itself remarkable. In normal council proceedings, any significant decision faces challenges. Different factions have competing interests, different governments prioritize different concerns. The entire framework assumes that contestation is normal and healthy part of reaching decisions that serve collective interests. But here, decision affecting political geometry of half the galaxy, choice determining who shares authority over alliance's most powerful government, meets with universal acceptance despite not being everyone's preferred option. Because everyone present understands what that single word means. What David, spoken with Serafina's absolute certainty, represents. It wasn't impulse, wasn't sudden decision made without consideration of political implications, wasn't surprise choice announced to create dramatic moment. It was consensus already earned. 3 years of David working closely with Serafina, demonstrating competence that everyone who pays attention to alliance integration projects could observe. 3 years of building working relationships with human and Thessari officials who could verify his capabilities. 3 years of Serafina's judgment being validated as she selected him for increasingly significant coordination responsibilities. The choice was telegraphed for anyone who was watching closely. Not announced formally, but visible in pattern of assignments, in how Serafina increasingly relied on David's perspective for complex multicultural challenges, in how his role evolved from basic cultural advisor to genuine strategic partner in integration planning. People who were paying attention saw this coming, recognized that Serafina was building toward this selection through years of demonstrated partnership rather than making sudden choice based on impulse or rebellion. And even people who weren't paying that close attention recognize Serafina's authority and judgment. 15 years of effective governance. 15 years of making decisions that serve Thessari and alliance interests. 15 years of demonstrating that when she makes choices, even surprising ones, they're typically well-considered and strategically sound. Her track record means that when she speaks David's name with absolute certainty, people's default response is to trust her judgment rather than to question it, to assume she has good reasons based on direct experience with his capabilities rather than to assume she's making mistake that needs correction. That's what consensus already earned means. Not that everyone agrees David is optimal choice, but that everyone agrees Serafina's judgment about appropriate consort is trustworthy enough that challenging it isn't worth the political cost when the selected candidate is viable and competent. The silence of acceptance continues. No objections voiced. No challenges formulated. Just universal recognition that the decision is settled and that adaptation rather than opposition is appropriate response. After the pause extends long enough to make clear that no objections are coming, Lord Vethros, serving as ceremonial master of proceedings, speaks formally. The selection is acknowledged, Dr. David Chen is recognized as consort select to Empress Serafina, with all authority and responsibility that position entails under Thessari law and alliance treaty frameworks. The formal acknowledgement makes the selection legally binding. David is now officially consort select, pending completion of whatever ceremonial and legal procedures Thessari tradition requires for finalizing the position. Across the chamber, delegations begin transmitting updates to their home governments. The information spreads rapidly through alliance communication networks. Empress Serafina has selected Human Cultural Advisor as her consort. The choice was formalized before Galactic Council. No objections were raised despite the selection not being the strategically obvious option that many observers anticipated. The lack of objection itself becomes a significant part of the story being transmitted. Not just who Serafina chose, but how that choice was received. The universal acceptance despite the choice surprising many observers. The demonstration of Serafina's political authority, so absolute that single words spoken with certainty, was sufficient to settle decision affecting half the galaxy without requiring debate or justification. David remains standing in the attention, processing the transformation of his position and his future. 3 minutes ago, he was cultural advisor expecting to witness someone else's selection. Now he's consort select to the galaxy's most powerful government, facing responsibilities and authority he never anticipated. Serafina steps down from the central dais and approaches him directly. Breaking protocol slightly, normally consort select would approach sovereign to acknowledge selection, but characteristic of how she operates, establishing from the beginning that their partnership will be based on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchical performance. She stops in front of him, speaking quietly enough that nearby delegates can hear, but that the conversation feels personal rather than purely ceremonial. I chose you because 3 years of working together convinced me you're the partner I want for governance rather than just the selection that optimizes political advantages. I know this transforms your life in ways you didn't choose. But I hope you'll accept the position, not just because I selected you, but because you believe the partnership will be meaningful, and because you're willing to share the responsibilities that sovereign authority entails. I accept, David responds, still processing but certain enough to state his acceptance clearly. I'm honored by your choice and by your trust. I'll serve as your consort to the best of my ability. The formal acceptance completes the selection process. David is now consort select officially and by his own stated acceptance, not just by Serafina's declaration. Delegations begin approaching to offer formal congratulations, the diplomatic courtesy that follows major announcements, acknowledging the new reality and beginning process of relationship building with person who now shares sovereign authority over Thessari Empire. Ambassador Webb approaches, offering congratulations while clearly recalibrating his understanding of human Thessari relationship dynamics. Dr. Chen, or should I say Consort Select Chen, congratulations on your selection. The human government looks forward to working with you in your new capacity. Various Thessari officials offer similar acknowledgments. Lord Vethros with composed grace despite not being chosen himself. Commander Cathara with military professionalism. Regional governors with polite recognition of new political reality they'll need to work with. After the immediate ceremonial requirements conclude, David has brief private moment with Serafina before they're swept into additional formal proceedings. You spoke a single word, David observes. Just my name. No explanation, no justification, no defense of the choice against strategic alternatives, and no one objected, no one challenged. Universal acceptance of decision, affecting half the galaxy based on one word spoken with certainty. That's what authority built over time enables, Serafina responds. 15 years of demonstrating competent judgment means that when I make choices, even surprising ones, people's default is to trust my assessment rather than to question it. When I spoke your name, everyone present understood that it wasn't impulse, that I had good reasons based on direct experience working with you. That challenging my judgment would be political mistake when my track record shows my decisions are typically sound. Influence built over years can render opposition irrelevant, she continues. Not because opposition is forbidden or because I have power to punish dissent, but because accumulated trust means that people recognize my choices deserve respect even when they're not what observers would have anticipated. The most powerful declaration wasn't speech defending the selection, David says. It was single name spoken with certainty that communicated the decision was already settled and debate would be futile. Exactly, Serafina confirms. If I had given long explanation defending why I chose you over more obvious candidates, that would have suggested I was uncertain and needed to persuade people. Speaking just your name with absolute certainty communicated that the decision was final and required no defense, that my judgment alone was sufficient basis for the selection. Authority so absolute that choice becomes final the moment it's voiced, David observes. That's remarkable level of political capital. It's political capital earned through 15 years of effective governance, Serafina responds, through consistently making decisions that serve Thessari and alliance interests, through building trust that when I make choices, they're well considered even when they're initially surprising. That accumulated trust is what allowed me to speak your name and have it accepted universally despite the choice, not optimizing obvious political advantages. I hope I can justify that trust, David says quietly. Both your trust in choosing me and everyone else's trust in accepting your choice. You will, Serafina says with confidence. I didn't choose you on impulse. I chose you because 3 years of working together demonstrated your capabilities and our compatibility. The galaxy just witnessed that sometimes the most powerful declaration is not elaborate speech, but single names spoken with certainty by someone whose judgment has been proven reliable through years of demonstrated competence. The assembly spanned worlds. Representatives flickered in through hollow relays. Every decision made in that chamber would echo across trade routes and war corridors. Objections were common. Dissent was expected. Nothing passed without resistance. Until she stood at the center dais, the weight of 1,000 alliances resting effortlessly on her shoulders. The moment had come to formalize the binding. She looked at me. I was not the strongest candidate, not the wealthiest, not the most strategically advantageous. I stood there because circumstance had placed me in orbit of her influence. She spoke a single word, my name. It carried clearly across every channel, every relay, every chamber. There was a pause afterward, the kind that usually fills with protest. Nothing came. No objections, no challenges, no legal counterarguments, only acceptance spreading in quiet acknowledgement. Because everyone present understood what that word meant. It wasn't